Hi, today we're going to talk about integrating evidence into your papers. We're going to start with the question of whether you should quote or paraphrase the evidence that you want to include. There's a few guidelines I can give you. Really, there are only a couple of reasons why we ever use quotations. First is if the original is written in very special language. If there's something about the way the sentence was originally written that you really love, that you don't want to change, you can use quotation marks. The other reason you might use a quotation is if the original is a famous quote or saying that most people would recognize. For example, you've probably heard Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. That's a speech that most people, certainly in the United States, would recognize. The speaker was very famous, and the quote is, that speech is quoted again and again and again. So we generally would not paraphrase that. Instead, we'd use the quotation. Most of the time, instead of using a quotation, you are going to paraphrase. I say use paraphrases most of the time. Let's talk about how to introduce a source. Your book has many examples of good ways to introduce a source. Please look at all of the examples on pages 81 to 83. I'm just going to talk about a few of the examples that they show you. If you have both the author and the title, you can use both. Here's an example. In College Success, Clark, 2010, writes that students should study 2 hours for every hour in class. So we have a paraphrase that's introduced with both the title of the article and the author. You've been doing this in class as well. That year, 2010, is the year that the article was published. Tomorrow in class we're going to talk about a different way to cite our sources. We're going to be using a different format. Here's another example. In this one, the writer doesn't know the author of the article College Survival Tips. So they just don't include the author. Instead, we get College Survival Tips, 2007, recommends that students prepare a daily schedule. This is also fine. Sometimes, if the author is an important person and you want to highlight who they are or why they're an expert, you might decide to include some information about them. So here we have Clark, director of the College Success Program at Winston University, writes that students should study 2 hours for every hour in class. This is great, especially for Einstein evidence, when you really want to focus on why that person is important. Okay, now let's talk about connecting evidence to the topic sentence. Your whole paragraph really needs to be going back to the topic sentence. So we're going to read through this paragraph here and talk about the different parts of the paragraph. We start with a topic sentence. The value of independence is one reason why young and old people become isolated from each other. After the topic sentence, we need to have a connecting explanation. This is just an explanation of that topic sentence. Being independent is an important quality of life for most Americans. Since childhood, people have been taught to be independent, and the notion continues through their old age. Now we introduce the evidence. Margaret Mead, 1971, an anthropologist, writes in her article, "Grandparents Have Copped Out," that old people don't want to be a burden to their children, so they try to live their lives independently. Now we need some more connecting explanation. In other words, old people do not want to interfere with their children's lives. Young people also believe their lives will be better without their parents as constant companions or advisors. So you see how we have, we already have a paraphrase, but then, in other words, given some more explanation. And then finally, we end with a concluding sentence. Consequently, communication between the generations is limited and isolation gradually occurs. These connecting explanations are really important. You don't want to just have a topic sentence and evidence. You need to write sentences that connect, sentences that show us how your evidence is connected to the topic sentence. You need connecting explanations to explain the evidence that you give us. That's really important in your paragraph. You may find that as you've been reading a lot of articles, sometimes there's a piece of evidence that you want to include that may need some background explanation. It's really important that you assume that your reader has not read the same articles that you have read. Do you need to give some background information before you introduce your evidence? Give the background information before you introduce your paraphrase of the evidence. Again, assume that your reader has not read the articles you've read. In fact, you might want to assume that your reader doesn't even know anything about robots. It's good to just assume that your reader is completely ignorant on the topic. I'd also like you to avoid dumped evidence. Dumped evidence is giving a quote or paraphrase without a good introduction or explanation. When you dump evidence, your reader has to try to figure out the purpose of the quote or paraphrase. Let me show you an example. An uncertain outcome is one characteristic of risk. In her article, Taking the Bungee Plunge, Belafonte writes that we build sustainable confidence not by taking life-threatening risks, but by gradually working at things we never thought we could achieve. Another characteristic of risk is that the activity must be challenging. This is really problematic. The problem here is that we don't have any connecting explanations at all. We have a topic sentence, and then we have this quote, but there's nothing to connect the quote to the topic sentence. There's also no explanation of the quote. So this is really a poor paragraph. We need the writer of this paragraph to explain that uncertain outcome, that idea. We need them to introduce this quote in a way that we understand why the quote is being added. That's very important. Okay, now that you have learned a little bit about integrating evidence into your paragraphs, it's time to do some practice. I have 3 exercises that I want you to do in your book. Please go to these pages. You need to do Now You Try exercise on page 85, page 86, and page 87. Please read the instructions carefully. We will review all 3 of these exercises tomorrow in class. Thank you.